like to welcome everybody to the 2016 Candidate Forum hosted by the City of Kalispell Council. Tonight we're going to have several individuals up talking to you, the audience, about why they're running for office to represent you. And they're going to answer some specific questions that we've come up with at the council level for issues that we feel are important to the citizens of Kalispell. With that, I'm going to start first off with Mr. Ian Wheeler. Ian is a Libertarian candidate for House District 6. So what I'd like to do is welcome you at this point in time. So welcome, Ian. Please introduce yourself. Tell us why you're running for House District 6 and how you plan on earning the vote of your constituents.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mayor Johnson. So as he just previously mentioned, my name is Ian Wheeler. I'm the Libertarian Party candidate for House District 6. I'm a student at the University of Montana, and I study political science. And I've been a resident of Flathead County for the last 13 years. I'm running for House District 6 because I want to spread the libertarian ideology across the state and show people that limited government and individual liberty should be the paramount values that we take going forward when addressing issues of governance and of personal conduct. I think that specifically in regards to land management, giving the power back to the state, as we know how to manage our lands much better than the federal government does. I think giving power back to the state as far as education, getting off of federal standards, and I also think that we need to address our right to privacy, which is guaranteed to us in our state constitution. And these three things are something that I believe strongly in and are the reasons why I'm running for State House District 6.
Great. Ian, the first question I'm going to give you is related to infrastructure funding. In 2015, the legislature and the governor failed to come to an agreement on an infrastructure plan for the state of Montana. Now, 2 years later, as quoted by the Beacon, Montana's general fund is nearly 4% behind projections, with oil and gas tax receipts down by more than half. The slowdown amounts to more than $67 million the government had counted on. What's more, fluctuating prices at gas pumps are translating to budgetary uncertainty. With this as a backdrop, was the prior legislature wise to avoid bonding improvements, and how would you propose to fund infrastructure in the 2017 session?
That's a great question. So living in Montana, infrastructure is incredibly important as tourism is such a vital industry for our economy. As a libertarian, obviously it's hard to address an issue of funding because we believe in lowering taxes and less government spending, but obviously there are things that need to be, steps that need to be taken in order to address this, this problem. One such way I think we can go about doing this is, for example, we can legalize the sale of recreational marijuana and tax it so that we can use those funds for things like infrastructure that are so direly needed in our state. And rather than taxing hard work and what people already own, we tax them on their consumption. And so that it's more of a fair tax for Montanans, and it provides for things that we need and currently don't have in the status quo.
So as a follow-on, should we entertain removing some of the issues from politics and some of this issue from politics in Helena, and simply amend Montana Code Annotated 7-6-15, which for the viewing audience is related to the resort tax law, and remove the population limit in the resort community definition and allow all communities in Montana the freedom to vote to fund their own infrastructure projects?
That's a very tough question to answer. I think that state level funding is going to be the best. I don't think that doing it on a localized way is really going to be effective. I think that certain communities will be able to do it a lot more efficiently than others, and I think that it's something that the state of Montana should address more so than local communities such as the Flathead Valley.
Okay, and I'm going to do a follow-on because you mentioned legalizing marijuana and taxing the sale of marijuana. Question I have related to that is if we tax the sale, legalize and tax the sale of marijuana, would we generate enough in tax revenue to pay for what some say are the social ills that come from legalized marijuana use?
So I personally don't believe that there are social ills that come to legalized marijuana use. I think that we'll be able to pay for things like higher teacher salaries, we'll be able to pay for infrastructure improvements, and realistically, if we legalize marijuana, we'll actually we will treat these people who are nonviolent drug offenders, so we get them out of our overcrowded prisons, and we can put people who actually deserve to be there in there, and we can treat this rather not a criminal issue, but more as a mental health issue, and give these people the help that they actually need, Whereas when we just throw them in jail and give them a sentence, we're not doing anyone any favor.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is public safety. In your opinion, what is the role of the state government as it relates to public safety and protection of our residents?
Okay, so just to build off of even the last question, I think if we do legalize marijuana, again, it would free up our prisons so that we can put these actual violent offenders and people who are committing crimes on other people to actually be in our prisons. And I think that the overcrowded prison population is something that we need to address in the next legislature session, whether it be through the means that I've just mentioned or something else that my fellow legislators might bring up. But I think that the state, there definitely is a problem with overcrowded prisons, and that's the first way to address that issue.
I'm going to bring us into a current topic. Recently, the city of Missoula has invited in refugees, especially related to the crisis in Syria. My question is, should each community in Montana be allowed to make their own decision as to whether they accept refugees in their communities with no consideration of the impact it may have on neighboring communities?
I believe yes. I think that each community should have the decision to make, or should have the right to make that decision for themselves, because each community is going to be differently well equipped, or rather not equipped to handle the refugee situation. And I think, for example, Missoula felt that they would be able to support these refugees, and I wholeheartedly support their right to make that decision. But at the same time, people in Ravalli County, for example, or even here in our own Flathead County, may not support that decision, and I think that they should have the right to not bring these people in. But I don't think that it makes so much of an impact on neighboring communities that it should be a one decision, I guess.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a philosophical question so the viewing audience can get an understanding of the principles that govern your behavior. As an example, perhaps in the course of this next legislative session, you'll be presented with an offer to get somebody's vote on a bill that's very important to you to have it passed, in exchange for your support on another bill that violates your promise that you may have made to your constituents. Simple question. Do you take the deal as the ends justify the means?
So my political ideology is that of limited government, and individual rights are what should be the most important thing. And so I would not support any legislation that would violate that, so I guess my answer would be no.
Okay. So last question, and this is your closing. If elected, please tell us what a successful legislative session would look like for you. What would you like to see accomplished?
All right. For me, I think a successful legislative session would look like a balanced budget, first and foremost. I think that we need to cut down on wasteful spending. Each legislator should ask themselves a question before we fund something. Is this something that government should involve itself with? And if the answer is no, then we shouldn't provide funding for it. And I think that there's a lot of things we need to leave to the private sector. I think we need to cut regulations so that small business owners can compete just as much as these corporations. And I think that overall, if we can limit government and we can make sure that people's civil liberties are protected, whether it be privacy, whether we bring back the power to manage our own public lands to the state of Montana, or whether we get off of federal standards for education and actually provide the type of education that our students deserve, I think that's going to be a successful legislative session.
Great. Well, Mr. Wheeler, I appreciate you showing up, and good luck in the election.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome Carl Glemm. Carl is a Republican candidate for House District 6. Carl, welcome. I'd like to do is have you please introduce yourself. Tell us why you're running for House District 6 and what you plan on doing to earn the vote of your constituents.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for having us here. I'd like to thank the Kalispell City Council and the mayor. So a little bit about me. My name is Carl Glemm. I am the Republican candidate for House District 6. I have been the representative in that district for 2 sessions, the 13 session and the 15 session. Then I'm a small business owner. I have a home building company, and I'm married, and we have 3 kids. And they are the reason that I'm running. And that has been steady throughout my campaign season. Some people probably get tired of hearing it, but it's still the same reason why I run. is I'm concerned what we're leaving in our state for our kids, for the next generation. I want it to be a good place where they can stay, where they can find a good job and stay here and raise a family, because it's a great place to raise a family.
Perfect timing.
All right.
The first question I want to ask is related to infrastructure funding. As you're well aware, in 2015, the legislature and the governor failed to come to an agreement on an infrastructure plan for the state of Montana. Now, 2 years later, as we learn, it's quoted in the Beacon, Montana's general fund is nearly 4% behind projections, with oil and gas tax receipts down by more than half. The slowdown amounts to more than $67 million the government had counted on. What's more, fluctuating prices of gas pumps are translating to budgetary uncertainty. With this as a backdrop, was the prior legislature wise to avoid bonding improvements? And how would you propose to fund infrastructure in the 2017 session?
That's a really good question, and I was at the heart of part of that infrastructure discussion that happened in the 2015 session. There is a lot of infrastructure that happens throughout the state every session. Almost close to $100 million is awarded through the state through different grants and things, TSEP grants, RRGL grants. And so there's a lot of infrastructure that happens. Now, there also is separate bills that come forward for infrastructure. In the last two sessions, we've had separate infrastructure bills to try and get infrastructure specifically focused on eastern Montana when the oil boom was going on. The problem with those bills is that the governor didn't like them, so he would veto them. He came forward with his own infrastructure bill late in the session, in the 15 session, and it had a lot of bonding in it, had $100 million worth of bonding in it, and it also had a lot of what I refer to as port projects. It had a very large museum, it had some big renovation projects that, in my opinion, are wants, not needs. What we need to focus on in infrastructure is what we need. And we have plenty of needs throughout the state. There are failing water systems, failing sewer systems, and those are needs that our citizens need to have. Was it wise at that point with our funding, with our revenues being down this year? The bonding part of it, if we had bonded that, we would have obligated money that we will now have this session to pay for things that we're going to need. It's going to be.
Go ahead and wrap it up.
It's going to be a tough session. There's going to be some belt tightening that's going to have to happen, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because state government has grown a lot in the last couple of years. So I think, again, we need to focus on needs rather than wants.
Okay. As a follow-on, and you know the question that's coming, should we entertain removing some of the issues from the politics in Helena and simply amend Montana Code Annotated 7-6-15 resort tax law and remove the population limit and the resort community definition and allow all communities in Montana the freedom to vote to fund their own infrastructure projects?
So I guess here would be the part of the crux of that situation, and you hit on it, is that with opening it up, you're going to allow every town to be able to have a resort tax. If that's the case, why wouldn't we just go to a statewide sales tax, which the voters have resoundingly said they do not want? So that's kind of the problem with that. I mean, you're going to end up with it everywhere, and once we introduce one more new tax, then everything just keeps creeping up. We already have high property tax, we have high income tax, you add in a sales tax, and it's tough enough to make a living in Montana now.
Okay. Next item is going to be related to public safety. In your opinion, what is the role of the state government as it relates to public safety and protection of our residents?
I think that state government needs to outline, I mean, most of the laws that we have on the books are to protect citizens, and I guess I'm not exactly following where that's going.
Okay.
There's a follow-up.
Tell you what, I'll do a follow-up.
Okay.
We'll talk about this. So based on recent news from the city of Missoula and the crisis in Syria, should each community of Montana be allowed to make their own decision as to whether they accept refugees in their communities with no consideration of the impact this may have on neighboring communities?
I guess I would I would lean towards no. I think that should be a statewide direction that we try and go. My personal feel on it is that if we don't absolutely know for certain that those people are safe, we should not be letting them in. If it's a 1% chance and you've got 100 of them, that means there's one that is going to be that % chance that's going to cause harm to people. So I think that in terms of public safety, we need to be doing everything we can. In terms of the refugee crisis, there is it's a tough situation, but I think that the answer for that is to create safe zones there where they're at and try and keep them there. I think that's where they'd rather be. They'd rather be in their home country. Who wants to be uprooted, moved halfway across the world? But I think paramount is that we keep our citizens safe. And if we can't guarantee that, if we can't make the absolute best effort in that, then we're failing our citizens. We can't let that happen, even if it's a small percentage chance.
Okay. Now I'm going to take the freedom and loop back to the other question because I have another follow-on for you. As you stated, the voters of Montana years ago resoundingly defeated the sales tax that was proposed at that point in time. When that was proposed, that was a third leg of taxation. There was not an elimination of income tax nor of real estate taxes. So that was, in my opinion, why that tax was resoundingly defeated. When we look at the resort sales tax, the credit that goes back in the communities towards the real estate taxes, it can be a net neutral tax within the community for the residents of that community. With this backdrop, where it could be net neutral to the citizens of that community, is it necessarily a bad thing?
So the benefit to that you're speaking of is that you catch the tourists. Mm-hmm. The negative effect of it is that everybody that lives outside of the city Kalispell doesn't see that benefit. So anybody that lives out in the county doesn't see a reduction in taxes. Correct. And yet they're having to pay that. So it's in the idea of the statewide sales tax, I think the only way that could even have any kind of legs to go forward is to completely remove one or the other, either the income tax or the property tax, because if you're sitting there with 3 different taxes and each one creeps up a little bit, it's either easier to keep a leash on 2 of them than it is to keep a leash on 3.
So I guess with that, within your answer, then my other question is it necessarily equitable then for those people who don't live within that community to have advantage of that infrastructure without paying for it?
Well, I think that they do in effect. I mean, people who come into town from out of town or in the county, they're participating in things that pay taxes in that community. When we come in and shop, we're shopping at restaurants and stores that are paying taxes in the community. Okay. So there's a connection there.
It's coming through the real estate taxes and the income taxes.
Yeah.
Okay. That's fair enough. I'm going to move on because we're going to run short on time. Real quick, this is a philosophical question. As an example, during the course of this next legislative session, you'll be presented with an offer. Let's say you're presented with an offer to get somebody's vote on a bill that's very important to you. In exchange for your support on a bill that violates a promise you made to your constituents. So you would have to vote with that other person for their bill on something that violates what you've told your constituents you wouldn't do. You take the deal? So my question is, do the ends justify the means? You got what you wanted in exchange for this. So do the ends ever justify the means?
No, and I can give you, ironically, that happened to me last session. I had someone that wanted to trade a vote for a bill that I was carrying. It was my bill. They were offering, if I voted for another bill, that they would reduce opposition for my bill. And that is probably the only time I've screamed at someone in the Capitol. I was so furious. I could not believe that they did that to me. That goes against every piece of integrity that anyone could have. Nope.
Okay, thank you. So in the last question, this is your closing. If elected, please tell us what a successful legislative session looks like for you. What would you like to see accomplished?
I would like to see, a positive session. I would like to see us come out with a good budget, which is going to be difficult this time. One of the things I was talking about earlier when I ran out of time, it's going to be a belt tightening session, and we're going to have some tough decisions to make because revenues are down. In particular, I chair one of the subcommittees in appropriations, and that subcommittee oversees most of the natural resources and transportation, which are some of the areas that are hardest hit with special funds, special accounts that fund those areas. They're going to be very hard hit. We're going to have some real decisions to make, and so I think a good budget coming out of this session is going to be key.
Carl, I appreciate you coming in and appreciate the tough questioning because I did take you a little further in some of those things, but we've talked about them before and I felt comfortable doing it.
You bet.
But appreciate you coming in and speaking to the public and wish you the best of luck in the election.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. I'd like to welcome Paige Rapley. Paige is a Democratic candidate for House District 8. So, Paige, welcome to the Kalispell City Council. Please introduce yourself. Tell us why you're running for House District 8 and how you plan on earning the vote of your constituents.
Well, I'm running for House District 8 because I care about the people. It's a low-income area for the most part. I work in the nonprofit human rights sector for Love Lives Here in the Flathead, and I'm an advocate for public schools, mental health, and yeah, it's a strong human rights platform, and I guess that's all I have to say.
Okay. First question is going to be related to infrastructure funding. In 2015, the legislature and the governor failed to come to an agreement on an infrastructure plan for the state of Montana. Now, 2 years later, as we learned in the Beacon, Montana's general fund is nearly 4% behind projections, with oil and gas tax receipts down by more than half. The slowdown amounts to more than $67 million the government had counted on. What's more, fluctuating prices at gas pumps are translated to budgetary uncertainty. With this as a backdrop, was the prior legislature wise to avoid bonding improvements? And how will you propose to fund infrastructure in the 2017 session?
You know, I think that a lot of what slowed down the infrastructure bill was the budgetary cuts. And they kept cutting back on this bill out of fear, in my opinion. I think votes against infrastructure are votes against jobs. We really need to pass this bill. I think to continue to dilute it even further is just going to halt the what we need to improve our roads, improve our jobs. I know our infrastructure here in Montana has a C- rating. We have one of the lowest rates in the country for construction jobs, and we can only cut back so much. And Yeah, we just need to do what we can to get this passed. And I think we can make a couple of cuts to the bill that'll make it more passable, but ultimately we need to put the jobs first. We need to put the safety of the roads first, and we need to get this thing passed, and negotiating across the aisle is, I think, ultimately what's going to do it. But again, a vote against infrastructure is a vote against jobs and the safety of the roads.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you a follow-on question to that. As we look at infrastructure funding in the state of Montana, what would be your priorities? Would it include roads, water, sewer? Would it also include museums and buildings at the university? Because I think that is where the crux of the problem really lied with the legislature in 2015.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think there is some wiggle room in negotiation-wise. I think the core of infrastructure is the roads, it is the water, it is the bridges, and I think that, there is some room to look at things that can be removed from the original bill, such as schools and museums. I would like to see those things represented in some way. I don't know if infrastructure bill is the right way to do it, but I would have to look at the bill since I'm not serving right now. I haven't seen the full bill. But like I said, we need to work together and figure out a way to make sure that everything that should be represented in the bill is, and the things that maybe should not be can be cut out. I don't know the exact right way to do that without looking at the bill in its entirety. But again, roads, bridges, water definitely need to be in there. And perhaps things like museums need to be represented in another way. Our schools, our university system do need to be funded. Without looking at how much those were part of it, I don't know the best way to fund those, and I don't know if infrastructure bill is the right way to do it.
Okay. So as a follow-on, should we entertain removing some of the infrastructure spending issues from politics in Helena and simply amend Montana Code annotated 7-6-15, which is the resort tax law, and remove the population limit in the resort community definition and allow all communities in Montana the freedom to vote to fund their own infrastructure projects?
Would that be part of the local option tax that they've been talking about?
Yes.
I have looked into that, and I think as if we're looking at non-essentials only as part of that local option tax, it is something that we could work with. I think as long as it can be negotiated for each area that does it, so that it can go towards things that each town who implements it can target. Not every area might need to have it go towards infrastructure. Some areas might need it to go towards schools in that area. Some areas might need it to go towards other things other than infrastructure. So I don't know if looking at infrastructure as a whole being removed, like you stated, I think we still need to work on infrastructure, and that should be a separate thing to the local option tax. I do think that my personal opinion is that, every tax plan has winners and losers. Personally, as a Democrat, I'm interested in a tax plan that shifts that burden to those who can afford it more easily, and the local option tax does do that. So I think that this is one option as far as that goes. But I think we should look at that as a separate issue to the infrastructure issue.
The next question is related to public safety. In your opinion, what is the role of the state government as it relates to public safety and protection of our residents?
I have a lot of thoughts on public safety. We have a big mental health problem here. We have a big drug problem here. I've talked to police officers who talk about we need more towers because they go out far west and their radios aren't working, and I'm sure that affects fire and EMT as well. I spoke with Police Chief Nassett, and he was talking about county commissioners not wanting to adopt a pawn shop ordinance that affects our drug problem because they're selling things outside of the city limits it affects them. We have a state prison that are, you know, over capacity, and so we need a second one of those. We need a mental health hospital in the state. You know, I think there's so much that affect our public safety that is not just what we typically think of as public safety issue. And a lot of it is mental health and drug related. You know, I think we also have this gun issue that, and I'm not going to get into Second Amendment because I'm fine with Second Amendment, and I think everyone has the right to their weapons. But, you know, as a Democrat, I personally would never be someone who would fund a school and then turn around and sign a bill allowing people and staff to walk down the halls of the school with a weapon. And we have folks running for office that want to do that. We have, you know, hate and white supremacists, and, you know, all of these groups here that, you know, don't get properly addressed. So, I mean, there's a lot of issues that...
Okay. I'm going to bring you back to one issue then.
Yes.
Based on recent news from Missoula and the crisis in Syria, we know that the community of Missoula has made the decision to bring refugees into their community. Do you believe communities in Montana should be allowed to make their own decision as to whether they accept refugees with no consideration of the impact these refugees may have on the neighboring communities?
I don't know that this is a one community issue, because that's a federal issue that refugees are coming in. And, you know, refugees are not coming in that are not vetted. They're all vetted or they wouldn't be coming in. So this really isn't a public safety issue. People are being vetted. Those people that are vetted are coming in. And the real issue with the refugees is making sure that there's enough housing, and making sure that they have somewhere to go when they're in.
So I'm going to speak back on the vetted issue. What about areas where we can't vet the refugees? Should they be allowed into the country?
I think anyone would be against unvetted refugees, but all of our immigrants, all of our refugees are being vetted. The only folks that might not be is if folks are sneaking in on other visas or things and staying, but that's not the question. So okay. I guess if you have information about people being unvetted, I wouldn't have that information.
Okay. I'm going to move on to a philosophical question so the viewing audience can get an understanding of the principles that govern your behavior.
Okay.
As an example, perhaps in the course of the next legislative session, you're presented with an offer to get somebody's vote on a bill that's very important to you.
Right.
In exchange, you have to support one of their bills, and you have to vote contrary to the interest of your constituents. Simple question, do you take the deal as the ends justify the means?
You know, I think for me, it would really depend on the bill. It would depend on how that would affect my constituents. It would depend on how that would affect the city. It would depend on how that would affect the valley. It's a bit too open of a question for me to be able to answer that.
Okay.
Because there's way too many factors to weigh.
Okay. So the last question in your closing, if elected, please tell us what a successful legislative session would look like for you, and what would you like to see accomplished?
You know, I stand for, you know, human beings. I stand for their rights. I stand for clean air. I stand for health care, keeping public lands public, jobs. I think a successful legislative session would be keeping access to those things as much as possible. Being able to work across the aisle. You know, I'm aware that I'm progressive, but I'm also aware that I'd be representing conservatives as well. And so being able to work with folks that are not all like myself, but, you know, that's my job. I think we need to remember that we represent everyone when we go to Helena, and being able to work within, committees and do our best jobs to represent everyone in Kalispell when we go, or Summers or wherever we are, and do the best jobs that we can. And remember that we're all human and that we all make mistakes, but we're doing our best to represent our fine cities when we go.
Great. Paige, I appreciate you. Thank you for coming in today, and good luck with the election.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome Brittany McLean. Brittany is the Democratic candidate for House District 9. Brittany, welcome to the Kalispell City Council chambers. Please introduce yourself. Tell us why you're running for House District 9 and how you plan on earning the votes of your constituents.
Okay, thank you. I am, yes, running to represent Evergreen, which is District 9, the House District, and I am planning mostly to do a get out the vote in that area and do doors. So knocking on doors and just talking to people who live in my district.
Okay. First question this evening is related to infrastructure funding. In 2015, the legislature and the governor failed to come to an agreement on an infrastructure plan for the state of Montana. Now, 2 years later, as we learned in the Beacon, Montana's general fund is nearly 4% behind projections, with oil and gas tax receipts down by more than half. The slowdown amounts to more than $67 million the government had counted on, but it's not there. What's more, fluctuating prices at gas pumps are translating to budgetary uncertainty. This is the backdrop. Was the prior legislature wise to avoid bonding the improvement plan? And how would you propose to fund infrastructure in the 2017 session?
I feel strongly that it's really important to have a balance of cash and bonding. I think that it would be perilous to be cash poor, so I think having a diversified approach to funding is a good idea. And in terms of how to fund it in the future, I would need to really learn some more about the ways that could happen. And, once the session starts, there's a solid 6 months left in the fiscal year to know how much money we really have. So it's important to not, to really wrap up and see how much money we actually have before we make any decisions.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a follow-on question related to funding. Okay. So, as a follow-on, should we entertain removing some of this funding issue from politics in Helena and simply amend Montana Code Annotated 7-6-15, which is the resort tax law, and remove the population limit in the resort community definition and allow all communities in Montana the freedom to vote to fund their own infrastructure projects?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. So, should we entertain amending the state law and basically allow all communities in the state of Montana then to have the opportunity, like the community of Whitefish has, to fund infrastructure projects with a resort tax?
I do. I think it's an excellent idea to have local communities involved in making their own decisions. They know the infrastructure that they need, and I think that in most all cases they know best what to do in their own local communities. So and I am, just to add to that, really in favor of alternative funding mechanisms so that local areas can come up with their own ways to raise money. So that if it's non-essential items, that they can tax those items and have ways to bring in their own revenue.
Okay. I'm going to ask a follow-on then on the resort tax. One of the arguments that we see against sales tax, because the resort tax is a sales tax, is that the sales tax is regressive. It actually hurts those who can't necessarily afford to pay it. Do you believe that's the case?
I do agree with that.
Okay. Anything that you would recommend in any way to address that with a resort tax?
With the resort taxes, I think just mostly with resort taxes, it is just incredibly important to bring in resort taxes, and I think that we as a state should be taxing there's a reason that people come to our state. There's a reason that that we have a great tourism industry, and I think that we should tax people who are coming in, and I think we absolutely need to tax. It's a strong source of revenue, and it's not something that we should discredit or remove.
So next question, I'm going to move on to public safety. In your opinion, what is the role of the state government as it relates to public safety and protection of our residents?
I think that government plays a really very critical role in public safety, and it's one of the main things that government does is to protect its citizens and protect its people. So it is very critical to make sure that we have the basic mechanisms in place, law enforcement, of course. And I think it's also really important to train law enforcement and to give them support and recognition and help them with new ways to do their job and to do it well. And absolutely public safety is a foremost issue.
Okay. So I'm going to do a follow-on. Based on recent news from Missoula and the crisis in Syria, we see that Missoula is allowing refugees to move into their community. Should each community in Montana be allowed to make their own decision as to whether or not they accept refugees with no consideration of the impact those refugees may have on neighboring communities?
This is, obviously it's a very contentious issue, and it's being talked about a lot. I listened on the news this morning to a young man who was 24 years old and getting up every single day as a father and just removing rubble from the streets. And I was driving back after dropping my daughter off at school, and it just really struck me about the differences of how someone is living and how I am living here. So I definitely do believe that we have to support in humanitarian ways. I also understand equally important is security. So I believe that as a state we should come up with this policy and have it be one policy. I don't think that it's a good idea to have different areas making different laws. So I think we have to come together as a legislature and we have to decide how are we going to keep Montana safe and how are we going to make sure that we are being humanitarians at the same time. So it's a difficult challenge, but that's why we have good, strong leaders in our legislature.
Next question I'm going to move on to is a philosophical question, so the viewing audience can get an understanding of the principles that guide your behavior. Let me give you an example. Perhaps during the course of this next legislative session, if you're elected, you'll be presented with an offer to get somebody's vote on a bill that's very important to an issue that you're working on. But you have to give your vote. So it's you get their vote in exchange for you giving a vote on an issue that's important to them. But that issue is contrary to something that you've told your constituents you wouldn't support. So a simple question. Do you take the deal as the ends justify the means?
No. No, I don't think that the ends justify the means. That was one of the first books that brings me back to being a freshman at MSU and reading about that. So no, I don't believe that at all. It's critically important to be a person of honor, to represent your constituents. I think in some cases, if you can make a compromise and it doesn't compromise your ideals, that is one thing. But if you are ever compromising your ideals in any way, I would never do that, regardless of the outcome.
Okay. And Brittany, if elected, as your closing, please tell us what a successful legislative session would look like for you. What would you like to see accomplished?
A successful legislative session for me would be, it's very intense when you're campaigning, and it's very contentious, and you have people who have been really battling with each other, in a sense, to make it there. And so my hope for the session would be that once you get there, that is all cleared away, and no matter where people are coming from, no matter what side of the aisle you sit on, that you are coming together as a group and really recognizing that you have to listen to each other and you have to work together because you're there together and you're it to solve problems for Montana. So just alleviating the division once you get there.
Brittany, I'd like to thank you for coming to
Yes,
the council
thank you.
chambers tonight, and good luck
Thank
in
you
the
so
election.
much. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to welcome Eileen Bach-Beck to council chambers.
Thank you.
And Eileen, can you please introduce yourself to us and tell us why you're running and what you would like to do to earn the vote of your future constituents?
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and council members. My name is Eileen Beck. I'm a candidate for the Montana House of Representatives for District 11 for the Democratic Party. I was born and raised in Helena. Graduated from high school there. My dad had an independent business there, so that was a pretty big part of our lives. And I graduated from college, from Linfield College in McMinnville, Oregon, with a BA in English. Then came to Kalispell to teach at Flathead High School until my marriage and moved to Spokane. There I attended Eastern Washington University and obtained my master's in history with an emphasis in frontier and Native American studies. And our first son was born in Spokane. But by 1980, I was able to get back to the Flathead, and when my husband, Steve Beck, was employed as a lineman with the Pacific Power, and then later when it became Flathead Co-op, was the safety director for Flathead Co-op. We've raised our two sons here, both through public schools, and I continue to live in our home in the district. So I didn't answer your second question.
Didn't answer your second, but we can work that in. So first question I'm going to ask you is related to infrastructure funding. In 2015, the legislature and the governor failed to come to an agreement on an infrastructure plan for Montana. Now, 2 years later, as we learned in the Beacon, Montana's general fund is nearly 4% behind projections, with oil and gas tax receipts down by more than half. The slowdown amounts to more than $67 million the government had counted on, but it's not there. What's more, fluctuating gas prices are translating to budgetary uncertainty. With this as a backdrop, was the prior legislature wise to avoid using bonds to pay for infrastructure? And the next question to tie in with that is, how would you propose to fund infrastructure in the next session?
I think with interest rates at the rate they are, it's lower than most any time in my lifetime. Mortgages are lower than my parents paid for their house in the late 50s. So I think it's foolish not to take advantage of that if we can. I'm not one that's in favor of debt, but we also need to be sure that we deal with the things that are crumbling around us. I guess I would favor, at some point, we're going to have to raise taxes on ourselves if we're going to protect our infrastructure and increase the safety that we all rely on. So there's never a winner, or there are always winners and losers in a situation like that. But yes, I would have encouraged bond funding, and I think at some point we're going to have to tax ourselves more.
So you may have to look at in the 27th session then, looking at some combination of bonding and raising taxes on the citizens of Montana to pay for the infrastructure. That's what you're looking at.
Yeah, I would say a combination, yes.
Okay. So I'm going to ask a follow-on. Should the legislature entertain removing some of this issue from the politics in Helena and simply amend Montana Code Annotated 7-6-15, which is the resort tax law, and remove the population limit in the resort community definition and allow all communities in Montana the freedom to vote to fund their own infrastructure projects? So in other words, we could give all communities, by doing that amendment, would have worked to give all communities in Montana the ability to have a tax like they have in Whitefish.
I would be in favor of that. It's impressive to see the changes that have happened in Whitefish. I appreciate driving on smooth roads up there. And a lot of the other things that they've been able to do concurrently, projects that they're able to do concurrently with each other. So yes, I would think as long as it's something that individual communities can vote on, can construct for their own needs, and can raise or lower according to their popular will, I think that a local option tax is only a fair way to go. If we have the same number of people coming and going through our town as Whitefish has, certainly we should be able to have a resort tax. And I think it's only fair then that other communities who aren't as tourist-oriented as we are have that same option.
Okay. I'm going to move on to public safety. In your opinion, what is the role of the state government as it relates to public safety and protecting our residents?
Well, as I see public safety as a result, basically, of running in this campaign, I'm more aware of how integrated our drug abuse and our mental health issues are to our public safety. And I think we are so far from so many of the racial issues and so many of the other social issues in our quiet little community that we need to be proactive and need to recognize that horror can happen here. I think I'm not familiar enough with the budgeting with local departments, but I certainly think, of course, there again you've got a funding problem, so it's a matter of priorities, and I would like to see at least the attempt to be there for local public safety organizations.
Okay. I'm going to ask a follow-on to this.
Okay.
Based on recent news that we have from Missoula, we see that the community of Missoula has invited refugees in to their community. We're also aware of the crisis in Syria and the issues, especially, I'm going to tell you, the issues that we're starting to see in Europe with the refugees that are streaming into Europe. My question is, should each community in Montana be allowed to make their own decision as to whether they accept refugees into their communities with no consideration of the impact their decision may have on neighboring communities?
That's a really good question. I believe that our government does do a good job of vetting if we allow them the time to do the vetting that is needed to be done for refugees. I've seen what Missoula has done with the Viet Cong after the Vietnam War. It's a little different situation because there wasn't a terrorist perception in the public mind. But I don't think we can stand to see the kind of terror that these people have and not be willing to offer some help at some point. Whether we do that individually as communities, or I don't think we can get a state consensus that we would do it statewide, so I think it would have to be communities.
Okay. I'm going to move on to a philosophical question so the viewing audience can get an understanding of the principles that govern your behavior. So let me give you an example. Perhaps during the course of this next legislative session, you're presented with an offer to get somebody's vote on a bill on an issue that's very important to you, in exchange for your support on one of their bills that violates a promise you made to your constituents. Do you take the deal as the ends justify the means?
I'm not one to believe the end justifies the means, but I'm also not one to believe in promises. So I would be very hesitant to promise anything to a constituent, particularly because I don't think you can understand what's going to be in the bill till you get the bill, till you see the devil in the details. I'm just not inclined to make deals. On the other hand, I have just recently heard of an argument in favor of the old ways where people were making deals in the privacy of social engagements and were able to get more done because they became friends, because it wasn't everything things weren't as transparent as we hold them to be today. So there is some benefit in collaborating with each other. It's not my style, but I can see that if it meant something for education, I would be very drawn to seeing what could be done, although I don't believe in making promises ahead of time.
Okay. So last question, this is your closing. If elected, please tell us what a successful legislative session looks like to you. What would you like to see accomplished?
The most important thing for me would be to see a legislative session where people were working together congenially, where it was effective, where we have to have a balanced budget by constitutional arrangements, by the Constitution of the state. So I would just like to see, obviously, an infrastructure bill, something that at least moves us forward. I would like to see make sure that we hold ground on education for youngsters as well as college-educated people or students. And I'd like to see some consideration of the needs for Boulder and Colstrip and their loss of economic base, or potential loss of economic base. So I guess the thing that's most important to me is that we are able to work well together regardless of our political ideologies.
Eileen, thank you for coming to the chambers and answering our questions, and good luck in the election.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to welcome Derek Skies. Derek is a candidate for House District 11. He's a Republican running for that seat. Derek, I'd like you to introduce yourself and tell us why you're running for House District 11 and how you plan to earn the vote of your constituents.
Excellent. Thank you for having me here, Mayor. Sure. Thank you for the City Council, and thank you to citizens in Kalispell and everybody else who's watching today. The reason I'm running is because I want to return to prosperity. I spend a lot of time at the doors, and many people are upset that the cupboard isn't as full as it used to be. There's not enough gas in the truck. There's not enough choices for their kids in education. There's not enough control of where grandma and grandpa are going for their retirement. Everything seems to be sliding to where the state is controlling everything, and folks are not happy with those choices. Folks want more prosperity, more freedom, more choice, more independence, and they want me to bring it to them. And I told them I'm definitely the guy that can do it because I've been there before, and I know how to butt heads with the powers that be to drive the bus to work that kind of change.
Okay. First question is going to be related to infrastructure funding.
Of course.
2015, the legislature and the governor failed to come to an agreement with the infrastructure plan for the state of Montana. Now, 2 years later, as quoted in the Beacon, Montana's general fund is nearly 4% behind projections, with oil and gas tax receipts down by more than half. The slowdown amounts to more than $67 million the government had counted on, and it's not there. What's more, fluctuating gas prices are translating to budgetary uncertainty. With this as a backdrop, was the prior legislature wise to avoid bonding for infrastructure improvements? And how would you propose to fund infrastructure in the 2017 session?
Thanks, Marty. That's a great question. Infrastructure, the problem with infrastructure as far as the last cycle is the definition of what infrastructure is. I support infrastructure when it's roads, bridges, sewers, and water treatment facilities. That's infrastructure. Schools, museums, those kind of things are not, and pet projects in certain districts, those are not infrastructure needs. And so first thing we need to do is get a solid definition of what the real infrastructure need is. Then we know what we got to do to fix it. Now, the last cycle, if you really read the bills that were passed, they passed many infrastructure need bills. Those got passed into law and were funded. The ones that failed were the ones that had that extra stuff in it, a museum or a pet project in a district. When that was added into the infrastructure bill and the governor said take it or leave it, the legislature was trying to find a way to maneuver it so that we would have just the infrastructure needs. Yes, I think that if it has a bonding, and that means to those of us that are at home, you got to take a loan to pay for it. If you've got to take a loan to pay for it, then through all the years from now until when that loan's paid for, we're paying for that infrastructure need. If we have it in the budget and can afford it that year, we should pay for it that year. To borrow it is to put the bill on our children, and that's not what we should do.
So as a follow-on question, should we entertain removing some of this issue from politics in Helena and simply amend Montana Code Annotated 7-6-15, the resort tax law, and remove the population limit in the resort community definition and allow all communities in Montana the freedom to vote to fund their own infrastructure projects? You knew it was coming.
I knew it was coming. And that was a good segue to tie it into the infrastructure need. That's a neat angle. I like that. Well, I know that Bozeman is going to lead the charge, I believe, on this, and they have 35,000 folks. I know they're going to hire a lobbyist, and they're going to push for this from them, and that helps the city of Kalispell because I believe we're, what, 21, 22? So basically, to understand what the mayor just said, the city of Whitefish has the ability to tax because their population is at or below the cap that is currently in the law. What some of these other cities would like to do is to increase that funding cap so that they can do the same tax locally. Now, the question I'm sure you're asking me is, should we do it? Should we abridge the state's responsibility for it and give it to you guys? I think the state is still in charge of code, Montana Code Annotated. That's our constitutional duty, is to write laws and statutes. But what we should do to fix it so that the cities have the ability to fund themselves, that's the big discussion. And I'd love to have that discussion. I'd love to, you know me, I was against it in the beginning because most of my constituents want nothing to do with the new tax. And in my shallow, non-new tax ideas, I was against it. But when you and I sat down and talked about it, and I sat down with my awesome neighbor and talked about it, there's a lot of things in it that are beneficial. But we need to make sure we write it in law and write it in a way that it doesn't increase the tax burden on the average person in Kalispell. It actually shifts the tax burden to folks that are visiting our city. And if we can do that and put some caps and some stuff in it, then I think it has a great chance to go through the legislature.
So next question, related to public safety. In your opinion, what is the role of the state government as it relates to public safety and the protection of our residents?
Wow, excellent question. Well, of course, the state runs the highway patrol. That's funded by the state. And the investigative arm for the judicial services, that's the Attorney General and his branch. And so that's state control. And then finally, the state prisons. Now, I know that we've had an uptick in crime here in Kalispell and in the Flathead and across the entire state, in point of fact. And a lot of those crimes are related to things that are not just crimes. I think there's a huge influx of drug-related crimes. And so the question I'm sure you're asking is, do we need to fund a new prison? Do we need to build more incarceration facilities from the state funding perspective? And there is a need for that. I see that. But let's also look at why folks are going to jail and going to prison. If 9 out of 10 are going there because of drugs, that's the triage for the problem, is the abuse of drugs. Let's figure a way to not only provide for the incarceration of the folks that are breaking the laws, but find a way also to help treat these folks so that they can free themselves from the dependency and the horrors of drugs.
I'm going to ask a follow-on question. Actually, I'm going to have two on this. The first one is we've learned lately, nobody else has had this question, so I apologize for this. But we've seen recently where the Supreme Court is looking at a 5th justice in Flathead County because of the backlog in cases and the caseload that we see in Flathead County. I've heard rumors and I've heard grumbling amongst the attorney population that this isn't necessary. Does the legislature have a role, or does the state have a role when it relates to public safety in looking at the efficiency of the judicial arm?
Oh, yeah, totally. Totally. If you look at the balance of government, executive, judicial, legislative, for us to have an equal playing field for all 3 branches, then we all should have a say. The legislature determines the number of Supreme Court justices. It could be no more than 7 and no less than 5. So if the state has the control of that, then why can't it also determine the level of district judges? Because that's determined by Montana's Constitution.
So another topic related to public safety. Based on recent news that we see from Missoula, Missoula is welcoming in refugees. We see the crisis in Syria, the refugees that are streaming into Europe, and some of the problems that we're starting to see creep in Europe. My question is, should each community in Montana be allowed to make their own decision as to whether they accept refugees in their community with no consideration for the impact it may have on neighboring communities?
That's another excellent question, and I disagree. The reason being is, obviously there's the vetting question. If you listen to what the director of the FBI and the CIA say, there really is no way to vet these people effectively because where they're coming from, there isn't enough data to determine what they are or who they are or their names. And so the vetting question is right there. The second component is, historically, if you look at where these refugees go, when they move into a city, they start in that city. Now, historically, they just want a foot in the door, and where they stay after that time frame changes. So an excellent example would be Missoula. If they move into Missoula, they're not necessarily going to stay in Missoula. Historically, they migrate to where the social services benefit them the most. And so should it be just up to Missoula to bring folks into Montana? I disagree. It should be up to Montana, because if Missoula decides to bring in folks and then they decide to move to Kalispell, Kalispell didn't get a say in that. So therefore, the state should have the say in it.
Okay. We're going to move on to a philosophical question so the viewing audience can get an understanding of the principles that govern your behavior. I'm going to give you an example. So let's say in this next legislative session, you're presented with an offer to get somebody's vote, an important vote that you need on one of your bills, in exchange for a vote that you have to give them on one of their bills. But your vote would violate a promise that you made to your constituents. Simple question. Do you take the deal as the ends justify the means?
No. Nope, never.
Okay.
My constituents come first. Do I get a minute to add to that?
You can get a minute to add to that.
The brutal thing of politics is it is give and take, but the give and take should be on the path to get to the objective. Now, I'm lucky that many in the legislature have Montana as its best interest, and that's great. So the path to get to Montana's best interest is where we have the dialogue. It's where we have the discussion. It's where we bend and flow to achieve that final result that we can agree upon that's the best for Montana. If I have to play a game where I'm going to try and get you to vote for my bill so I can vote for your bill, it never works. What you do is you sell the benefit of each bill, and you have each bill stand or fall on its own merits. You shouldn't trade favors for a piece of legislation. And it's unfair to the constituents of Montana. It's unfair to fellow legislators, and it's not a way to get things done, and I have never done it, and I will not do it.
Okay. Last question is your closing.
Woo!
If elected, please tell us what a successful legislative session looks like for you. What would you like to see accomplished?
Oh, excellent question. This next cycle is going to be very difficult. The reason being is the state of Montana has had 2 full cycles of over 20% growth. So now we have a beast of a state government just chewing up full-time employees and spending more and more money. Now we have the war on coal, so coal revenues are down thanks to our federal government. So now Montana's surplus is shrinking. What is it, 100 million? If you take away the 1 billion that the governor lost, I don't know what that number makes it, but so we're going to have less money this cycle. So the struggle should be on how to spend less. We need to wean government from this excessive continual growth. And I think the number one thing of a successful session this next cycle is to spend within our means, don't borrow, work on infrastructure needs, and I'd like to see a session where we repeal more than we pass. I had a good constituent here in Kalispell. He said, why can't you guys have a session where all you do is get rid of bad legislation? I would love that. Let's, instead of having 900 bills that bring new things, let's bring 900 bills to get rid of bad things. I would like reform, repeal, replace, spend what we earn, keep government small, give citizens more choices, prosperity, freedom, the Montana dream.
Derek, thank you for coming.
Thank you,
and
sir.
good luck in the election.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of our contestants, I'll call them, for coming in this evening and talking to the City of Kalispell and the viewing audience. The election in 2016 is a critical election from the federal level to the state level, and we need to pay attention to what every candidate is telling us. We have many issues at the national level that are important for us to decide as we determine the direction of the country. We have many important decisions when we look at the state of Montana. Where do we go as a state? At the City of Kalispell, we've been raising a lot of issues with our local legislators, begging the question, challenging on different things. It may not necessarily be because we want some of these things, but there's a frustration that we see at our level with how do we fund some of the needs at our level at city government. When we look to the state level and we see some things not happen, we get a little frustrated. Now, I'm going to admit, and I'm going to give some congratulations to the legislature and to the governor. We've seen a significant investment in Flathead County, especially Kalispell with the bypass. We still have many more projects we need to complete. It bothers me as a conservative Republican to look at the taxpayer to raise money to pay for these things. So as we look at our government, look at how will we reduce the government? How will we make it efficient? How will we pay for the needs, not necessarily the wants? There are many wants in life, but there are many needs. Through funding the needs, we can create prosperity. That's the key to the election in 2016. So I urge every one of you to ask the candidates the important questions that are, or the questions that are important to you. I've given you a glimpse into what's important to me. Ask them the questions that are important to you. Get engaged and vote. Without voting, you don't have you don't have the right to question what happens. So please vote in the future. Please vote. Thank you very much.